Welcome, everyone. The Costume Society of America thanks you for joining our Conversations on Dress web panel, a series that serves as a place to discuss issues in dress studies that promote ideas around diversity. I'm delighted to welcome you and be your host today. My name is Karen Oberg. I'm an independent historian who recently earned her PhD in apparel history from the University of Minnesota, and I also volunteer with the CSA Conversations on Dress series. Before I welcome our moderator and panelists, I would like to acknowledge that this webinar did receive some feedback as to the inclusion of non-Indigenous scholars on a panel about Indigenous dress, felt that it was furthering settler colonialist oppression of Indigenous people. This webinar highlights multiple and different ways to view dress and adornment in historical context. Scholars consider indigeneity, whether they themselves be indigenous or not, have ways of looking that go well beyond Western perspectives of sociology, anthropology, classical liberalism, Marxism, critical theory, and so forth. To those who wrote in, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this matter. CSA is committed to supporting the work of all scholars and recognizes that thoughtful discussion and debate are essential to building meaningful scholarship. Let me welcome our moderator today. Sage Davis is a third-year doctoral student and Dove Fellow at the University of Minnesota and is of the Anishinaabe tribe. Her focus is in the Apparel Studies Program is History and Culture of Dress, with an emphasis in Indigenous Studies. Her research interests include sustainability, design activism, and social justice in the textile and apparel industry. On completion of her PhD, Sage plans to become a professor of design to continue researching equity and sustainability while teaching through the lens of indigeneity. Sage?
Bushu kakina awia Sage Davis jagana shimung onigami sing indunjaba niminwendam aya omanungum. Hello everyone, my name is Sage Davis and I am from Anigam, Minnesota. I am happy to be here today. I introduced myself in the Anishinaabe language in order to keep my language alive, as there are not many Anishinaabe language speakers today. Welcome to this webinar on Indigenous theories of dress. We will be discussing scholarly ideas and research regarding Indigenous dress and adornment. I will introduce our panelists. First, we have Karen Kramer, and she is the curator of Native American and Oceanic art and culture at the Peabody Essex Museum. Her long-standing commitment to innovative approaches to Indigenous art and culture helps shape the museum's ambitious program in Indigenous art. Kramer directs PEM's innovative Native American Fellowship Program, which provides training for rising Native American leaders in the museum, cultural, and academic sectors. Kramer is a doctoral student in American Studies at Harvard University, where she focuses on art-based critiques of settler colonialism, Indigenous arts and methodologies, and contemporary Native art and activism. And we have Presley Mills. She is a designer, illustrator, and researcher, and is a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. While attending X University for her Master's of Arts in Fashion, she focused on the embodied experience of decolonization through fashion. Presley's research centers on making as a practice-based method of inquiry to emphasize Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. Next, we have Shakay Ottman. She is Anishinaabe and also has British, German, Polish, and Norwegian heritages. She is a member of Fishing Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. Ottman received her MA from the Royal College of Art in the Victoria and Albert Museum and Royal College of Art History of Design program in 2021. Currently, she is teaching the inaugural Indigenous Fashion course at her alma mater, X University, where she graduated with a major in history and a minor in fashion design in 2019. Thank you all for being here. We will start with the first question. What does dress mean to you as a researcher?
So I'll kick off. answering that question. Thank you for having me. For me, when I consider dress within my research, I kind of consider it in a very broad way. It goes beyond just like garment studies or adornment. It's also an opportunity for items that can tell story, but also they're also a method for change or resurgence, for example. So I avoid kind of narrowing down my definitions of dress, also as a way to avoid creating any kind of hierarchy of language. So as far as how I define dress, it's very broadly like anything worn on the body that we use to express something about ourselves or exist in the world. So for example, within my thesis research, I had collaborators use fashion hacking as a method to explore their personal definitions of decolonization. So they took a garment, they reconstructed and rebuilt it in a new way that was a way to express things that meant different things to them, such as like reclaiming their personal identity as an Indigenous person, mourning the missing and murdered Indigenous women, or also like how they saw their responsibility as an Indigenous person within their community. And all of these things were expressed through dress, which was in a way also a piece of art. So I think that's like broadening that definition is really helpful to allow those that room for interpretation. And then also I'm currently researching with my collaborator, Justine Woods, who's also a PhD candidate at X University. And we're exploring the idea of beading as medicine. And so to do that, we're hosting beading circles with Indigenous people and realizing how important having a making space for Indigenous people really allows them to rebuild their connection with the community and also heal the wounds that they've experienced and like the damage that's been done to their identity as an Indigenous person. And in addition to that, we're also realizing like the wearing of items can contribute to like that sense of empowerment, because like from the act of creating beadwork, you're embedding energy and strength into those pieces, and then you're gifting them or sharing them with a community that also benefits from wearing those items. So in that sense, that's why I really enjoy dress as an extremely broad term and a very flexible way of looking at it in research.
I just want to say I'm sorry I popped on the screen a little bit too early. I guess I was over eager, but thank you so much for having me and making space for this wonderful conversation. So the question is about how I think about dress and how I use it in my curatorial work. And I think about Indigenous dress in ways that are also kind of malleable and flexible. I think about Native dress as fashion. I think of Native dress as almost like a verb, like it is a state of being that we can think about as having movement and as having emotion and feeling, and also as being actively connected. So I think about ideas of relationality, and I think also about this continuum between the past, the present, and the future. And I think that the word art is definitely there in when I think about dress, and certainly fashion, but I don't think that those words are able to really capture the dynamism that is Indigenous dress. I imagine in your languages there's probably a better term than dress, perhaps, but I think about these things in terms of also the functionality of a piece of clothing or a textile, and I'm thinking about the context as well, in terms of materials and style, and I'm thinking about kind of all of these things are in motion when I'm thinking about dress. So
Thank you. Shake, what does dress mean to you as a researcher?
I would agree that dress is not limited to the garments, but all sort of body modifications and ways of adornment, and that art and fashion are really connected. When I'm explaining what Indigenous dress is, I often say that there's a lot of overlaps between art and fashion, that artists and fashion designers are in a lot of ways the same thing and use a lot of the same techniques and practices. And I think that's a good way to look at it. Because of course, sort of in wider discussions, there's also, is fashion art or is fashion something else? And I think Indigenous dress is fashion and it is art. And it has those meanings and those layers of history and culture and symbolism, and also that forward thinking and that newness that comes with fashion as well. My main focus on dress is how dress and identity interact. And so I look at dress as a material expression of people's intersecting identities and their culture. It not only expresses identity through style, but also how people live through the wear. If you're looking at garments that people have already worn, just seeing how they wear it reveals so much about how people live, which I think is an incredible resource. Yeah, and so as a researcher, I think Indigenous dress in specific is a tool to receive insight into how people want to live and how they do live. And it just gives us so much meaning and so many layers in both sort of the area of art and fashion and dress all in one. Like as Karen was saying, there's not really words to describe the fullness of it. Dress doesn't quite do it, art doesn't quite do it, and fashion doesn't quite do it, but mixing them all together does capture a little bit, yeah.
Yes, I agree. I am researching clothing or dress as a mode of expression and a tool of communication. Clothing is an expression of ourselves, and what we wear has an impact on how we feel about ourselves or how we want to feel about ourselves. Sometimes we dress up because we have a special occasion, because we want to feel pretty and confident. Sometimes we wear sweats because we want to be comfortable. Whether we realize it or not, though, I think our clothing is sending a message to the outside world. Because if you're wearing your sweatpants at work, that might be sending a different message rather than wearing your sweatpants at the gym. So, for our next question, when you are doing your research or teaching for your course, thesis, or exhibition, how do you approach garments which belong to or were designed by Indigenous people? We'll start with Shake.
I mean, first and foremost, I approach them with respect and with the knowledge that Indigenous cultures and dress have been appropriated and misrepresented for years and years. I never want to perpetuate stereotypes of a pan-Indian aesthetic. And I also approach garments as extensions of the people who wore them, kind of as I was saying before. When I was doing my research for my undergrad thesis on clothing of residential schools, I realized that all the dress theory that I was reading was from a Western perspective, and there wasn't an Indigenous dress theory that I could find. that was put all together. And so I proposed an Indigenous dress theory, which talks about connection to land and how land and identity are very tied together in a lot of Indigenous cultures, and how in Iroquoian and in most First Nations languages in Canada, in the States, leather and plant materials that are used to create dress are animate. And so there is still spirit in those clothes. And then looking at how when Indigenous people pass, our spirits return to the earth. And so while living, our clothes capture some of our spirit. So not only is there the spirit of the animal or plants that were used to create the fabric, there's also your spirit that's embedded in your clothes as you wear them. And so that's kind of what I think of when I'm talking about garments, that they're not just material objects, that they have a spirit as well, and they have the spirit of the people who wore them throughout their lifespan as well. So yeah, that's I think how I approach dress when I'm first looking into it.
I agree with a lot of what you've said of respecting the garment as something that carries a spirit, and also for me it's interpreting the story that it carries. Often items come to us without, like, they've been detached from their place in the world. I find it very different analyzing a piece that exists within a collection in a museum or something like that versus something someone has actually shared with you. And I think it's the challenge of coming across pieces when you're actually doing like material analysis or something, having like a real person to discuss that with. I think the most valuable times analyzing pieces or learning about garments have been from the person who made them or carried them with them, because they have that spirit and that family behind that piece. That is like the most valuable thing to me to discover. So I guess, yeah, how I approach it is like searching for that story that is often lost.
I love that. I think for me, it sometimes depends on whether it's a contemporary ensemble or a piece of clothing from the past. And so when it's a contemporary garment, the beautiful part is that there's often a contemporary maker that I can talk with and hear from and engage with about their ideas and what this particular collection meant to them, or what this particular design means, or the materials, or all of those things. And I think that kind of relationship building and collaboration really helps inform my work as a curator, and it also helps me share some of what is appropriate to share with our audience at the Peabody Essex Museum, or more broadly if it's something that I'm working on in writing. And then with the historical Native clothing, I think that keeping top of mind that these are personal, so many times they're personal objects, and thinking about that, again, that relationality and the relationship between the artist, the maker, and the wearer, and respecting that and kind of approaching that with care in mind. And then I can start to think a little bit more about doing a closer reading of the object itself and kind of seek out multiple layers of what it is that the garment is wanting to tell me or others. So it's not something that happens quickly, and it's not something that I think is ever, you're not necessarily ever able to reach an end point, but it's approaching it with curiosity and care, and that idea of collaboration, I think, is important. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I really like what you said about understanding what time periods the clothing is coming from. It's really important to approach it in the appropriate context. For when we are looking at historical pieces, we have to understand this is a piece of history from this time period, and it doesn't reflect the current situation of Indigenous people. Um, and then understanding how dress changes and continues to change. There are trends and innovations and new tools and materials to work with. I think I also agree with the respectful aspect, and that there is something really powerful about clothing, the way that you put it on your body and it is becoming like a piece of you. Um, and so I I think it was really awesome to hear that about the spirits in the clothing and how our clothes capture our spirits. Um, for the next question, how does your research, art, curatorial teaching work relate to Indigenous designers? Karen, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that my curatorial work relates to Indigenous designers through making acquisitions of contemporary Native fashion is a real priority, not just for me, but for the museum. And then also, of course, adding historical Native clothing to the collection where we can. But the contemporary Native fashion scene is so vibrant and just like bananas. There's so much fantastic talent right now that capturing that with not only fashion, and I'm including adornment in that as well, but also getting Native fashion across the museum and not just in the Native American galleries. Petra Slinkard has been an incredible ally and advocate, and others at the Peabody Essex Museum who are really eager to arm wrestle me for new acquisitions and contemporary Indigenous fashion in the Fashion and Design Gallery, in the Maritime Gallery. We really want it not only to be kind of siloed. And then I think also getting our Native designers involved in our programming and getting Native fashion kind of understood as being worn on the body and connected to politics and connected to identity and connected to so much of what you three have been also talking about. So it's kind of trying to make this whole movement multidimensional and also connected to communities and connected to the past as well in ways that are complex. And so it's really kind of trying to harness all of that and in 75 words in a label. But no, just I think that there's just so many opportunities that I try to do in my curatorial work with contemporary Indigenous designers in particular.
Awesome. Shake.
So I'm currently teaching a course, and a lot of my students are designers, which is really exciting. Not just Indigenous designers, but everyone. And so I think that hopefully in teaching a course like this and in there being more courses like this, Indigenous designers in the future won't have to deal with as much appropriation and stolen designs, and have more understanding around what they're creating and why they're creating it, and to have that additional level of support from other designers in their community and other, I'm not just teaching designers, it's also people who are going to be fashion journalists and a bunch of different areas within the fashion industry. And so hopefully these kinds of classes will be available in more and more places, and then an entire new level of support for Indigenous designers will emerge, and things will just be that much easier, hopefully.
So I guess I'm excited to hear, like, Karen, you speak about how you want to incorporate Indigenous designers in like your curatorial practice. I think when I think of this question, I thought of this year's Met Gala and Kerna Emmerich talking about it being the only Indigenous designer featured in that collection, and it kind of blows your mind that all of this talent that exists across Turtle Island is not being recognized at the same level as so many Western designers. So it would be exciting to just create space for Indigenous designers when you're in a position to do so. And I guess as far as my research goes, I think what I kind of enjoy most about like the practice-based methods that I've kind of used is empowering people to create their own pieces. I don't design fashion garments. I'm an illustrator, so that's the way I interpret the world. And so it's always cool to see how many people interpret things in different ways. And I think, like, as just a person on like in the world right now, it's really inspiring to see the diversity and the like degree of exploration that's happening in the Indigenous like arts and fashion world, like going on Instagram and finding like crazy pieces that I'm dying to save up to purchase. And I think like the way that a lot of Indigenous artists and designers are working in like a slow way is also really inspiring and innovative, and teaches people kind of the patience and like the dedication that you need to even just acquire pieces. I think is really an exciting change, and something that will kind of help the fashion industry as a whole.
Thank you. I have done research with Indigenous designers, interviewing, and I think that there are many ways that Indigenous cultures are different from each other and distinct in their languages, cultures, clothing, and the land from which they originated. But there are many similarities in the belief systems, such as the reciprocal relationship with our Mother Earth, and how the earth is not viewed as a resource from which we should continuously extract, but rather looked at as our home, our mother, from whom we should respect and love and take care of, because our lives and the lives of other beings depend upon her. So for our next question, how is Indigenous dress created in a way that relates to the history, the present, and the future? And I will start out with this one. I think that we have learned what we know from our ancestors, which has been passed down from generation to generation. And our ancestors were thinking of us before we were even here. They loved us so much to preserve as many aspects of our lives as they could, despite the trauma of the boarding school era, massacres, genocide, and disease that they endured. In the same sense, when we are creating today, we think about how what we are creating is going to have an impact on the future. Um, for instance, in some of the historical pieces that I've analyzed, we see the progression of innovation, and I see where clothes have been mended and how the beadwork is constantly refurbished and created in a way that can make a long lasting piece that becomes a family heirloom. We think of our ancestors as we bead designs that were inspired by the designs of the past. At the same time, we're teaching our children how to create these items so that the tradition continues. So that was my thought on this question. Um, Shakhay, do you want to go next?
Yeah, just as you were talking, it made me think of 7 generations, how 7 generations of our ancestors, 7 generations ago, were thinking about us when they made decisions, and how now when we think about what we're doing and the decisions we're making, we also need to think of the 7 generations that are coming, that are ahead of us. Yeah, so also when you were talking, it reminded me Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a Potawatomi botanist, talks about how in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about how time isn't linear like a river in Indigenous cultures. Time for a lot of Indigenous cultures is like a lake where it holds the past, the present, and the future in the same body of water. And I think that's really important to recognize because our past and our present and our future are also interconnected, and not just for us but for all of the people surrounding us. Our collective past and our collective future, and that interconnectedness, I think, is really well illustrated in how Robin Wall Kimmerer explains that. So I think in how Indigenous dress is created, I think all those elements are sort of in the lake. We come from our traditions and our ancestors, and that tradition and that meaning that has been built up within our cultures. And we're doing that in the present, but we're doing that with eyes towards the future, with eyes towards our children and their children, and also in terms of like accepting in new technologies that are making things easier and more sustainable, and really bringing in sort of a sense of this futurism as well, which I think is important to mention as well, because a lot of designers are using cool new technology and new materials, and that's very different than this idea of the Indigenous person as like a figure in the historic past. And so, yeah, I think that Indigenous dress is just sort of in the lake of time, I guess.
Yes, thank you. Presley?
So yeah, I was thinking of the same things of like, especially thinking about the future of Indigenous peoples. I think it's so important of acknowledging that there is still like a huge presence and ways of pushing forward past the traumas of the past. And I think like for me, Indigenous dress has, I guess, that was like a key for our family for maintaining that little connection, because I have never been to where my family's from originally. I grew up in the city, whereas and like my grandparents, they kind of limited our knowledge of Métis culture as a way of protecting us. They saw that as a way of like shielding us from the traumas that they experienced. So those like pieces of culture that they did keep were things like garments that they kept, like certain shoes that they had, and those are the things that I was able to discover and like given permission, I guess, from them to re-access the knowledge I personally could not have at the time. And so I guess I value those like pieces of the past as a way to tie back into like my present, and then as a way to carry forward my personal journey of like reclamation and just rediscovering those aspects that I wish could have been a part of my life the entire time. So yeah, and I think just as a whole, it is very cool to see the way that Indigenous fashions tie together so seamlessly, like the past, present, future, as one piece, and are really embracing all aspects of what comes with existing in the modern world. Like we're not, I think a lot of people do kind of cling to the dead Indian trope when they think about Indigenous people, because often a lot of people don't have the knowledge, and it's very cool to see modern designers as a like an entry point into people understanding who Indigenous people are now.
Thank you, that both Shake and Presley and also Sage. That was incredible to hear. So when Shake was talking about the lake that kind of contains the past, present, and future, I really like that so much. Robin Walkimer's evocation of that space is really just so wonderful. And I was thinking about how new technologies have always been a part of Indigenous being in the world, and how Indigenous peoples have always embraced, adapted, and figured out ways to incorporate new ideas and new materials, and through clothing and through items of personal expression, and relating that to futurism. I think these new kinds of technologies wind up being this cultural value that you see across time. Like you can go back 10,000 years and more and see how Indigenous people were always thinking about the future and also the past at the same time. It's this cyclical relationship. And I think that remembering that the past is always kind of in conversation with what is right in front of us, and then as well as what is ahead of us, I think it changes how you see what is in front of you, I think. And it makes it opens up dialogue. You can look at materials, you can look at motifs, you can look at color stories, and you can kind of make connections across people and ideas and communities.
For our next question, what aspects of dress are considered Indigenous? Is it the colors, techniques, or simply because the designer is Indigenous? We'll start with Presley.
So I found this a challenging question because it's sort of leading for an answer. but I guess my answer is not what the question was leading to. I think what I kind of thought of, like what makes something Indigenous, is the relationships that are attached to that affirmative dress. We've kind of talked about, this has been brought up a little bit already, but I'm a big fan of Sean Wilson and research of ceremony, and he talks about how all research has to be relational, reciprocal, collective, and accountable to the community. So I think when you're creating these pieces, whether it's like as a designer or as a researcher, it's kind of thinking about how those are all important things that are considered, and you are never an outsider to the research you're doing. Like, it's impossible to be this objective observer of something. It's always you, your relationships are informing what's being created through that research or fashion. And I really like his idea of like culture as an iceberg, and like there's those visual cues at the top, but it's like understanding the values that lie underneath is the most important part when you're researching fashion or anything really. So yeah, I guess my answer is it has to do with the relationships, and it really made me think about like kokum scarves and how those were an item that were Ukrainian that came to our land through trade and colonization, and it was that relationship between a Ukrainian community and Cree community that started something that is now something considered Indigenous, even though it has roots somewhere else. So.
Yes, I think that was an excellent answer. Shakade and then Karen.
Yeah, that was a really excellent answer. I don't know if I could explain anything better than that. I do know there's sort of conversations about what makes Indigenous fashion Indigenous, and whether or not it is like certain techniques or colors. And I mean, I always explain it as, if the designer is Indigenous, then the dress is Indigenous, because I think so much has been taken from Indigenous communities in terms of blood quantum and is this Indigenous enough? And I think that Indigenous designers who are making garments and creating objects that don't appear to be Indigenous still have the right to be calling their work Indigenous work, and that even if the ways that they're making isn't necessarily aligning with traditional values, whether that be because of the resources they have access to, or like monetary in terms of making their designs accessible to others, because they're Indigenous, I think they have every right to claim that for their design as well.
I guess following on that, the idea of an authentic connection to Indigenous ancestors and relationships, both of these, what Shake and Presley were saying, I think are vital. And I think there are so many thoughts that are swirling around right now, including how complicated it is right now because there are some who claim to be Indigenous who aren't, but then also all of the many complicated reasons why some people who are Indigenous but don't have access to their ancestral lands or families. So, I want to be very respectful of that as well. And I think some of the, like, as exciting and rich and important as any Indigenous maker is, whether it's using a time-honored pattern or material, then I think for me it's just as exciting to see Indigenous makers who are working in stainless steel and creating things out of their wildest part of their imaginations that could actually, very rarely be worn, or that sort of like avant-garde. It's just as exciting to me, and it's just as Indigenous. And so I think it really does include colors and techniques that have been passed down, and that knowledge, but then also it really is about that ancestral connections and cultural heritage. But I also, as a non-native person, I think it's important that I can't lead those conversations. It really has to come from Indigenous people. So, and there are many different perspectives on this, but I think the bottom line is listening and really being guided by voices in the field like yours.
Thank you. This was a question that I had asked as a prerequisite to some of the research that I was going to be doing about cultural appropriation, because I thought in order for us to understand that, we need to first understand what is Indigenous design. And so I think I really agree with a lot of what you all said, how it's very complicated and there's a lot of aspects to consider. One thing that I had thought about was the process of like innovating and embellishing, because we see that um, there's this tradition of like embellishing like everything everything that we have. So I was trying to answer this question myself, but thank you all for your input. That was awesome. uh, for our last question, what would a fashion course which included Indigenous dress in the ways everyone here considers the topic look like? We'll start with Shake.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about the fashion course that I'm teaching currently. So in terms of what my class looks like, it started sort of with the historical foundations of Indigenous dress, with a really strong emphasis on the various practices there are. My class focuses primarily on Canada and North America in general, but Canada specifically because it is a Canadian course, I guess, Canadian institution. So we looked at the history of Indigenous dress with some very specific examples, and then we looked at, after sort of setting our foundations, we went into cultural appropriation. We're looking at contemporary designers now and fashion enterprises, how Indigenous designers have been supported through various fashion shows and institutions. We're going to look at Indigenous fashion weeks, how those are different than non-Indigenous fashion weeks, and then fashion futures. And so we're kind of trying to cover sort of a little bit of everything. So you have sort of a foundation. I know the university this is a prerequisite for another course, a few other courses now, and so students can go into. We also looked at Indigenous making practices, and so students can go further into Indigenous making practices in a course, the next course, and actually learn how to do some of those things. There is another course, I can't quite remember what it's about, but in terms of how this course looks, it is really trying to get sort of a foundation. Don't want to say minimal, but I mean, you could have a course on each one of these topics. You could have a course specifically on cultural appropriation, or even a course just on beading as one of the many Indigenous making practices. So it is a foundation course, but that is sort of trying to give future courses that layer so these students can keep growing their knowledge.
Thank you. We'll go Presley and then Karen again. I like that flow.
Sure. I think when I think about this question, I think mainly about like my experience with like fashion history curriculums and how what was missing was kind of a continuous Indigenous perspective. I think that goes for the entire world of Indigenous people. I think there's obviously a emphasis on Western fashion, and like the only time things that are important to Indigenous communities get included is when it became something important for trade in like the history surveys. So I think like that's what I would want answered if I were developing a curriculum, because there must be a way that we can develop something that gives equal value to all perspectives throughout the history we're teaching, and rather than this emphasis that seems to focus on that narrative of coming to the new world, which I think no matter, in my experience, there's always been that view. And I think there's that problem with like North America and Europe, but it goes for Africa and Asia and like all pretty much the whole world. There's that issue, and I wish I had a solution for that of like how would you develop the curriculum that answers all those questions and is able to tell those narratives in a way that is kind of woven together, because I think there's also that challenge of like we've always taught history in this like straight narrative of start with like examining mummies in swamps in Europe in fashion history, and then like you end with like contemporary fashion in the 50s, and like that seems to be it. And I just wish there was a more flexible way to talk about it. So I don't have an answer, but I envision something more complex and woven together to teach that.
I feel like the kind of fashion course I would want to take is definitely a hybrid of both of your ideas. So I was thinking when Sage asked that question, I was thinking about how my course might be centered around some ideas rather than in some sort of chronology. So thinking about politics. And my course would only focus on Indigenous fashion, but in my ideal world, but you know, we could have a unit on politics, we could have a unit on change, we could have a unit on land and kind of pop culture or popular culture. I love the idea of doing something on cultural appropriation. I think that is so enormously important. And I know in my curatorial work at the Peabody Essex Museum, it's still like continuously necessary with our incredible fleet of docents who work there, but it's just after many years, they still don't quite get it. And so like that is, I think, would be a vital element. But by having an idea-based sort of unit system, it allows us to bring in the past and the present and how history can be seen and understood um, through these ideas and from an Indigenous community perspective. And then also my course would of course bring in lots of guest speakers so that our incredible fashion designers could share their ideas and their designs with the students. I think that would be really fun.
Those are awesome ideas. I would like to see some either a unit or a class that would contain some place-based learning, such as what types of materials come from that land and the animals in that area and what the climate is like and is it warm or cold. And then in the same aspect, I think it should consider the life cycles of these materials to, I guess, try to reduce consumption, um, and then incorporating some more of the end of the actual life cycles of the garments and how to recycle and reuse and um, upcycle. Um, but that is the end of our time. I just want to say thank you to the panelists for your insightful conversation. I am so grateful to have had this opportunity to speak with you all about this important and interesting topic.
I was really fascinated about the discussion about time. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about, even give us an example maybe about how you look at a garment or anything else related to dress, and talk about how you might see the past, present, and the future in that garment.
When I think about that, I guess I think about a woman I spoke to who here in Calgary, she's now like 94, and her mission for the last like 20 years or so has been to recreate the garments of her grandparents, who she never met. She only has photographs of them, and she recreates those garments, and she puts on fashion shows here using those garments. And her hope for the collection is for her granddaughter to continue that research and continuing that effort to like it's not even reimagine it, it's like rediscovering those pieces, because she never got to meet her grandparents. And I just thought that was like when you see a piece that she's working on, it kind of contains everything at once, like that hope for her future and also that longing for the past relationship. So I think that's not a very concrete answer to the question, but it's something that, like, those garments contain a spirit, like we mentioned in the very beginning. Like, it's just, it has this so much potential, and luckily I was able to like hear her story explaining them to me.
So I guess I think about how, using beadwork for example, how beadwork is created to be taken apart and recreated again. um, and there are ways to make it new, and there are ways to, if something happens where the beads are falling off, we can fix it. And I also had noticed how um, we make pieces that are like removable the from the entire outfit. Like for instance, like the yoke or the cape. There's a lot of different names for it, and how that is removable. And so it has a great purpose as to why too, because it takes a really long time to create beadwork. So we want to be able to keep it for as long as possible.
Building just on what you said, there's a really great um, documentary, I guess, or interview that's done by For Kinship, which used to be Arenda Tribe, um, where Amy Young, who's the designer for that company, talks to 4 Navajo weavers. And one of the weavers is talking about how, like, the Germantown style came about because the Navajo people would take uh, weavings from settlers and then rework it because that was the material that they had at the time. And so
Mhm.
there's that sense of taking, I mean, that wasn't even sort of their cultural history, but taking something that was a historical piece and then in the present reworking it and making something new and specifically Navajo out of it and uniquely Navajo. Um, yeah, but I think in terms of looking at dress in general, there's always a history to dress and why we dress the way we do, in how it's sewn or how it's created, um, and then in terms of present, I mean, we live in our present moment, and so how we interact with those garments or those objects are always sort of in the present moment, and the objects live longer than us. They continue on, whether that be in relation to people continually, if it's an heirloom piece, or even if it gets thrown into a landfill, how that returns to the earth or doesn't return to the earth. So there is sort of just a sense of continuity, and within that sense of time in Indigenous communities, or Indigenous pieces, there's a specifically Indigenous history, there's a specifically Indigenous present and a Indigenous future. And so while it doesn't, that sense of time doesn't just relate to Indigenous fashion, Indigenous fashion has that specifically cultural aspect to it, just like other cultures have their cultural aspects to their dress as well.
I don't have like a whole lot more that I could possibly say. So I just appreciated hearing about that. I think that any expression, any sort of creative expression, the maker brings to that object their worldview, their energy, their what is happening in the world around them. Like all of that is kind of like crystallized and funneled and output. And so I think when you think about that in terms of Indigenous dress and Indigenous fashion, that ancestral connections that we've talked about, and connections to place and community and the sort of like political context and like all of that is a part of that object, artwork, textile, um, item of adornment, all of the above. And then so that sort of encompasses the past and the present, but then also as Shakye was sharing earlier, that idea of 7 generations past and 7 generations forward, and the idea of time as not linear and on a continuum, I think is also a part of whatever it is that an Indigenous person is creating, whether it's conscious or not. I think it's kind of all wrapped in there.
Mhm. Yes, thank you. That kind of made me think about how like the time that we are taking to create these pieces, and how you're going through so many things during this time, and how that all is put into this work as well, about your your personal feelings and emotions, and things that you're going through. um, I think it's just so awesome.
Well, I have to ask you for a little more information about your earrings, of course.
um,
I can see yours very, very well. But you were saying that your sister made them, but
yeah, my sister created these. She was here for part of the conversation today. But these are my favorite earrings. I really like long earrings because I feel like they elongate my face. um, and so these are dentalium shells. And then at the bottom, my dad trades with his buddy from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And so he got these wampum from over there. And yeah, so I wear my earrings whenever I need an extra boost. They're not super heavy. I feel like some of the beaded earrings get to be really heavy after a little while, so that's why these ones are my favorite go-to earrings. They were actually a gift too, so I think that's another aspect of Indigenous dress, is the gift giving and receiving, and how we're always trying to give to other people, and let as a as a way of saying that I respect you, and I am glad you're in my life. And so I had kind of discussed this yesterday about how important gift giving is in the Indigenous cultures, um, and having, just how it just has become a part of our everyday lives, and how even our homes are like set up for gift giving in a way. So when we think about when people come over, usually we will offer them food, right? That's what I noticed with a lot of Native people. It's the first thing they ask is, what can I get you something to drink, or can I get you something to eat? And so that's our kind of way of being, of welcoming, and giving, to make sure that our family and our communities are taken care of in a good way.
Talking about gifts, going back to Robin Wall Kimmerer, she talks about the gift economy, and she does it so beautifully about how um, indigenous cultures, sort of North American indigenous cultures, our entire economy was built upon gift giving, and how in giving gifts that changes our relationship to objects, and how that brings a sense of gratitude, and um, like we honor the object more. It's more important to us. And so when you buy an object, it can be like a throwaway because you bought it, like it's for yourself, from yourself. But if you think of gift giving, it's like, well, I don't want to throw away these socks that my grandma knitted for me. That's a special object that's given, right? And so yeah, gift giving is so big.
Again, thank you to our audience and to the panelists, and also to Karen for being the host, and to the Costume Society of America for inviting us to have this conversation.
First, I also would like to thank today's speakers for their time and effort, and thank all of you for attending, and all of you who are watching this video later who did attend. Thank you for attending. Also, special thanks to the organizers who collaborated on this panel, which include our moderator, Sage, and our panelists, but also our CSA VP of Tech, Graham Wetzbarger, Conversations on Dress editor, Ashley Morrison, CSA VP External is Karen DePaul, and CSA Office with Katie On, and Kristen Miller-Zone, who is the Executive Director of CSA. Thanks so much. Have a good night.